us online. So the virtual mic is yours, Mr. Professor. You have 15 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me fine?
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be participating. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. You may know it was a big holiday here, Thanksgiving, I think the most important American holiday, so I couldn't make it out. And Thanksgiving, we like to think and talk about what we're thankful for, so I'll say listening to all these great talks, it reminds me, as someone who cares about democracy in the region there, how thankful I am for the journalists, the scholars, the NGO activists who are fighting there on the ground to defend these values. Because it's easy for me to do it from the safety far away here in the US, but I really appreciate everything that all of you are doing there, and I've enjoyed all the presentations today. Sorry I missed the first panel, but it was like 3 in the morning here, so after that I've been listening. So, all right, I will address the topic, and thanks, yes, to the Hungarian Europe Society, to the American Embassy for hosting and for the invite, and I will address the topic that they asked me to address, challenges of authoritarian regimes to the international democratic community, or more specifically to the European Union, is what I'll focus on, drawing on work I've been doing on this subject for several years now. So in 2012, you may recall, the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize, in part for its role in advancing democracy in Europe over 6 decades. And yet, in the decades since then, something was already talked about here, there's been this global phenomenon of the democratic recession, and the EU is very much touched by that. According to the leading ratings body of regime types, the Videm Institute from Stockholm, between 2010 and 2020, the EU was home to the 2 most rapidly autocratizing countries in the world, Poland and Hungary. 2 of the other top 5 fastest autocratizers were EU candidate countries, Turkey and Serbia. And if you go further down top 10, you find Slovenia also listed there, and other countries that have joined the ranks of backsliders in recent years. Other EU member states include Croatia, Czech Republic, and Greece. So while I think, and I would add just specifically, since you're in Budapest there today, of course, Hungary famously is the first EU state to be recategorized from democracy to autocracy. The European Parliament recently voted to kind of confirm the obvious among experts, labeling Hungary as a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy. So while the Nobel Committee, I think, was right to celebrate the EU's achievements 10 years ago in democracy promotion, something has gone terribly wrong since then, and the EU faces an autocracy crisis. So what I want to talk about today is how we make sense of this, why is it happening, what challenges do autocratic or autocratizing regimes present to the EU. I won't talk too much about what the EU can do about the problem. I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. I would just say the EU has all the tools necessary to address the crisis. Don't let anyone convince you that the EU lacks tools. That's a distraction. The EU has all the tools needed, it just chooses not to use them. So why is this happening? What's the diagnosis? Well, my work on this in recent years has started from the kind of perspective of comparative politics and emphasizing basically that we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening in the EU, because democratic communities, including fully fledged federal systems, of course the EU is only a kind of quasi-federal system, not a full federal state or anything like that, but even more fully fledged federal systems and states around the world face this problem quite regularly of the emergence of authoritarian states among their member states. It's true in federal systems all over the world. Historically, it was true in the US, it's been true in Mexico, Argentina, many federal systems around the world. So we shouldn't be surprised that it happens also in the EU. And it happens really for similar reasons. So if anything, I think we shouldn't be surprised. Rather, EU leaders should probably look back and chastise themselves for not taking the risk of the emergence of autocracies more seriously. And we can talk about that more if you want. But so, while this phenomenon is true and found all over the world, and while these authoritarian states or enclaves pose problems to democratic communities all over the world historically, it's even more problematic for the EU. So that's really my theme is what are the problems or challenges that the emergence of autocratic states pose for a union like the EU. So in all these kinds of systems, in any federal system, having individual autocratic states poses problems like the fact that they may violate and undermine the shared norms of the community, they may defy the authority of the center and its legal authority, they may actively infiltrate and try to undermine the institutions of the center by placing their personnel in powerful positions in the capital, so to speak, and trying to shift central policy in their favor. And by the way, since I'm speaking to you from the US and from Philadelphia where our democracy was founded, I would just point out that the US suffered from this problem for around 90 years after the Civil War, where we had southern authoritarian states that infiltrated the center in Washington, and they were protected by the Democratic Party, and they really poisoned our democracy for nearly 100 years. So we know the phenomenon here. But if we turn to the EU, the problems are much worse for a few major reasons. First of all, the EU is weaker than any full federation. It lacks significant fiscal power and coercive tools. It has a small budget, no police, a small federal bureaucracy. It relies for its functioning on national administrations and national courts, and ultimately on what the EU treaties call the sincere cooperation of the member states. So, in that kind of system, if you have an authoritarian state emerge in one of the member states, a bad faith actor who's willing to challenge legal norms and defy the legal authority of the center, it poses a real crisis because the union doesn't have much else to rely on. It relies on national courts to enforce EU law. It relies on national administrations for implementation. So once those are captured by an autocrat who is willing to defy all those norms, then the union really ceases to function in that member state, and it becomes a kind of legal black hole. Secondly, the problem of the infiltration of the center by the agents of the autocratic state is much worse in the EU, because the EU is much more intergovernmental than any federal system. So when you have an autocrat who sends agents to the center and who holds a seat on the council, they can create much bigger problems. So that's led to a phenomenon which some of the previous speakers today talked about, the phenomena of Hungary and potentially other autocratic states serving as Trojan horses within the EU. And there was a question in the last panel about what is the emerging geopolitical alignment of the EU? Will it shift from a more EU alignment to a more pro-Russian alignment, etc.? And Dori Dorfy was talking about that. I agree with her view that Hungary will never leave the EU, but I would just add or emphasize, I think it was implicit in her comments there, that part of the reason Hungary would never leave, besides the fact voters wouldn't support it and would destroy the economy, is that it's precisely by being in the EU that a leader like Orban has services to sell to geostrategic rivals like Russia and China, because he can sell his position within the council as a Trojan horse and make himself attractive as an ally or servant to these external powers. And that value would be lost if Hungary ever left. Anyway, we see many examples of this. Of course, Orban is currently trying to extort the EU, threatening to veto foreign policy, tax policy, etc. But it goes beyond that. It's not just the extortion. The infiltration also happens through appointments. Think of EU enlargement policy currently. EU enlargement policy is run by the enlargement DG. Who's in charge of that? Varhely, an agent and a loyal servant of Orban. So of course, currently EU enlargement policy has no credibility. Is the EU promoting rule of law in Serbia? Of course it's not, because an agent of Orban is running it. By the way, why is an agent of Orban running EU enlargement policy? Because that was the payoff that von der Leyen gave Orban in exchange for him supporting her becoming Commission President. Right, so this is how the system works. Okay, and finally, I think the other reason that the problem of autocratic member states is more problematic for the EU than for any domestic federal system is that basically the EU has a harder time escaping this situation because of what I've written about, calling it the authoritarian equilibrium or the autocracy trap that the EU is stuck in. I won't go into great detail on that, but a series of political factors really make it difficult for the EU to escape this situation. There's intergovernmental norms, the ingrained reluctance of national leaders in the Council to interfere in one of their domestic politics and to take enforcement action against one another. So that helps explain, for instance, why Article 7 is never used and why the Council does so little about backsliding in Hungary or Poland. Also, I would add that the Commission has been increasingly reluctant to use its enforcement powers in general ever since 2004. It's become more subservient to the Council and fears intergovernmental pressure, and that reluctance to enforce EU law has also affected the Commission's approach to the autocracy crisis and explains why we've seen so few infringements. And also, of course, there's the phenomenon of party politics in the EU and the protection that aspiring autocrats get from of the Euro parties. And so when you add all those political factors up, that helps explain why the EU has been so reluctant to cut off funding to backsliders like Hungary, and why it's ended up funding them. So let's keep in mind, and we can maybe talk in the Q&A about this debate that's going on now about rule of law conditionality. But up until now, the EU has been the biggest funder of democratic backsliding in the world. Okay? And I say that with great pain. I'm a huge Europhile. I like the EU, but we have to admit reality. So the EU funds all the backsliding and the autocratic sort of regimes in Hungary and Budapest. And so those factors all play in. So let me just move on and say a little bit about the prognosis in the last couple minutes I have. Where is this going? Can we expect change? Well, much depends on what the EU does in the coming weeks. I like quoting Lenin in this context, because I think his thinking may guide Orban, who learned a lot in the communist youth. Lenin famously said, "You probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw." So I think Orban maybe picked up those lessons, and he's been probing the EU, and so far he has found mush. So he continues to push, right? The EU has all the tools it needs to crack down on a tin pot autocrat like Orban, but it chooses not to use them, and he realizes that. So he's continued his drive toward autocracy over a decade. The choice is there for member states in the coming weeks. Will they suspend funding to Hungary or will they not? I don't think they will. We can talk about that in the Q&A, sadly. But if they don't, if the EU continues to fund the Orban autocracy, doesn't take tougher action, my prognosis would be very negative. I think the cancer of autocracy will continue to spread, right? The infiltration of Brussels and other EU institutions by these regimes will continue. I was recently speaking at an EU institution, I won't mention which one right now, and one of the questioners, a staff member, when he came to raise a question after my talk, started just spouting talking points straight out of Fidesz headquarters. It occurred to me, well, this guy got his job, he's an appointee, and he's there as a mole, and that's going to happen more and more. So the institutions will get infiltrated. The Council will continue to be infiltrated by more aspiring autocrats Let's keep in mind, by the way, that the council rotating presidency in 24 and 25 in 2 successive 6-month terms will be held by Hungary and then Poland, right? So don't count on them to do anything. So just in closing, what I would say, again, will the EU finally take robust action? You may be feeling optimistic from announcements you've heard that the Commission may be recommending going ahead with the suspension of some structural funds. I don't think so. I'm very skeptical. I see more smoke and mirrors, and I think that in the end, after some delay, they're likely to continue funding the Orban autocracy. And the last thing I'll say is, you might say they have no choice. He's extorting them. I don't buy that narrative at all. Orban can only extort EU member states if they're willing to be extorted, right? Ultimately, they have much more leverage over him than he has over them, right? His Hungary depends on EU funding and EU investment, the issues like German car investment that Szabolcs Pányi has written about, etc. So really, the leverage is all from the EU side. But sadly, I think that EU member states ultimately have demonstrated to us that they just don't care that much about democratic backsliding in Hungary or in Poland, and they think ultimately it's a problem for Poles, Hungarians, or citizens of other backsliding states to address, and they're willing to fund it so long as they don't think it causes problems for them economically. Thanks very much.